Hey, howdy, and welcome, kids. It is time for Conscious Embodiment, Astrology, and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. I am your host, Dr. Michael Lennox, and Zoe is here with me as well, as they are each week. And we are in the second week of the new year, January 9th through 15th.
Happy New Year again.
Happy New Year again. Listen, we did record several podcasts together so that Zoe could have a little time off. And so we're kind of back sort of like after vacation, even though you, listening audience, got a podcast delivered each week. We are back to our first actual recording date in the new year. So again, every once in a while, we break the fourth wall, kids. I know you like to pretend I'm talking to you on Monday, but we pre-record the week before. So Happy New Year. How's it feeling so far, Zoe?
It's good. I was actually up in Shasta and Humboldt with our mutual friend. So that was pretty cool.
Awesome.
I did some wild snow hikes, like snow up to my knees.
Beautiful.
I went to some hot springs in Oregon one day. And, just lots of trees and lots of rain. So it was like absolutely, what I needed.
Oh boy, that actually sounds yummy and healing and beautiful.
Yeah, so it's been starting off great, and I actually feel like January is, like all of January always gives me a really fresh feeling, which, you have a class that just started, right?
Yes, my Finding Your Voice class started this past weekend.
Awesome.
If you're hearing this podcast on Monday, we usually keep registration open through the Monday after class because you can catch up with the recording before, joining second class next weekend. So yes, go to michaellennox.com if you want to do a little class on investigating the psychology behind the limits to having a strong and powerful voice, but also learn a little bit about the voice from a technical and a resonance perspective. We cover it all. It's a deep class. Lots of discoveries on finding your voice. So certainly join me. Thanks for bringing that up, Zoe. I also am loving that people are responding with questions. I've already got my backlog of astrology questions, so I did want to dip into one question that came in from Nikki in Virginia, who asked just this fun and interesting question that's a vast sort of topic, and I'll try to distill some of it into a cogent answer. What she writes is, something that I've been curious about is how new science, in quotes, new science like the discovery of Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, and Chiron were incorporated into the ancient study of the Greek and Arab astrology. It seems like introducing such huge changes like these would have been quite controversial.
Yeah, that's a big question, and I'm also curious.
Well, it's an enormous question in some ways, and I can't speak into the whole history of astrology, but I can answer the question in one sensibility, that when a new planet is discovered, astrologers everywhere will have to get together and make some decisions. I don't know what astrologers were doing back in like 1781 when Uranus was discovered. Like I can't speak to the European astrological systems or organizations or guilds, but there would have been such a thing. There's such a thing today. There are astrological guilds, international trade organizations through which astrologers communicate and gather. I personally don't do that kind of thing. Not my game, but it exists. And so it would have existed in 18th century Europe when Uranus was discovered. So we, in modern Western astrology, our sort of history of astrology goes from Mesopotamia to Zoroastria, then to Babylon, then to Greece, through Greece to Roman Europe. And modern astrology has that thread where rulership of planets and signs was established over the millennia in such a way that every planet we knew about had ownership over certain signs. The sign Aquarius was ruled by Saturn, as was the sign Capricorn. So you have this planet that was known about for thousands of years because it's visible to the naked eye and named for the god of, time and lessons and responsibility and put in charge of the sign of Capricorn and the sign of Aquarius. So 1781 rolls around. The planet Uranus is discovered. There's a new consciousness in town. Whoever named the planet Uranus has some sort of power in the collective expression, right? Some gentleman named it Uranus, but the zeitgeist of the human consciousness received an idea that a new archetype was in town, named for a god that had a little bit to do with like lightning flashes. And now astrologers would have had to have gathered and said, well, if we have this new planet and it's named this, and it therefore relates to these archetypal sensibilities, what sign of the zodiac should this new planet rule over? And that was made, the decision was made that would be Aquarius. So now Saturn doesn't rule Aquarius anymore. He only rules Capricorn, and Uranus rules Aquarius. So with every time a planet has been discovered, astrologers have had to gather to decide who does this new planet have governance over. This actually happened last century with Chiron. Chiron was discovered in the 70s, named by some astronomer for this wandering mythological figure who had healing powers, and he wandered erratically. Chiron's orbit is an erratic orbit because he has his own gravity. He's not part of the original solar system. So his orbit is erratic. So the astronomer who named him Chiron was reflecting the wandering erratic movement of that god or that semi-god. So that imaginative use of the mind for that astronomer then winds up impacting the entire collective consciousness of the human race. Sometime in the 70s, astrologers in some guild would have had to have gathered and decided, well, what makes sense for this Chiron healing planet to rule? So they put him in co-rulership of Virgo, because astrologers got together and agreed Virgo is about all the parts fitting into place, everything having, thing in its right position. And healing in the body is part of the Virgo sensibility. So a planet that's newly discovered that has healing sensibility makes sense to assign the rulership to Virgo.
Well, I just have my own question. Do you know of any spicy fights on naming a planet?
I don't. Unfortunately, I wish I was a nerd in this way, because I'm sure there are history nerds who either know this stuff or... Now, also, there's a whole world of astronomy, and understand that the discovering of a planet, the naming of a planet is
quite different.
Astronomy.
Right, not astrology.
Not astrology. Astrology just says, hey, astronomers, what have you decided about this planet that we've discovered? Oh, we've named it Chiron. And then astronomers say, Chiron, wounded healer. Let's put this planet's rulership under Virgo's sensibility because it makes some sense. And if I were an astrology nerd, and if I had been an astrologer in the 1970s instead of becoming one in the 2000s, I might know about this from like who got together and how did they decide and how did they then convey that information.
Mm-hmm.
But it happens. So that indeed, every time new science comes along, Nikki, astrology has to respond to it, incorporate it, and make some decisions about the structure of astrology and how it's going to relate to the new science. And I'll just throw one in there about Pluto, which is the science decided a little while back that maybe Pluto wasn't a planet. And from an astrological perspective, Pluto could not give a shit about that change in demarcation because he is still the lord of the underworld no matter what you call him. One juicy thing that happens today, in fact, is that Black Moon Lilith is going to leave Cancer and enter Leo, and that's a thing. So let's start this conversation about Black Moon Lilith changing signs with a little instruction on what Black Moon Lilith is. Black Moon is a point inside the moon's orbit, in between the Earth and the moon. Now, the moon doesn't form a perfect circle around the Earth in its orbit. There's a wobble. The Earth and the moon are dynamically engaged with each other, and they pull on each other in this orbit in a kind of far apart, closer together, farther, closer, kind of like a breath, right? It's like a breathing orbit. It gets bigger and smaller in these, little waves of closeness and fartherness of the distance between the Earth and the moon. In fact, this is what the phenomenon of a supermoon is, which, by the way, has no astrological meaning. It's an astronomical phenomenon that modern astrologers have taken on as saying, it's a supermoon. It's like, it ain't a supermoon, kids. Yes, astronomically, it's brighter because the closer proximity happens simultaneous to a full moon, and then the moon is a little closer and a little brighter, and astronomically, the lumens are greater. They can be measured. We call it a supermoon because it's a little closer. And astrologers have picked this up as if to say a full moon that's a supermoon is a bigger lunation, and it's not. It's just another full moon, kids. But the point is, that should help you understand. The reason why I brought that up is I want you to understand that the moon and the Earth pull on each other in a wobble. That wobble has some steadiness to it in that it can be calculated as sort of a mean or an average of that wobble. And that point, that is that mean or that average of the wobble between the Earth and the moon, creates a point that moves across the ecliptic that takes 9 months for that point to move through a sign. So that black moon means it's connected to the moon. If it's connected to the moon, it's about the unconscious, because that's what the moon represents. But it's not the vast unconscious that is represented by outer space. It's what we're tripping on as that which is unconscious in us is spilling up out of the inner spaces that we trip on, that inside the moon's orbit kind of thing. So it's the mistakes we make that are driven by unconscious sort of drives. It's, the slips of the tongue that we used to call Freudian slips. That's the unconscious tripping up. These are things that are always followed by, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time, right?
Yeah.
That's how because I'll say tripping on your unconscious, and people will write back sometimes and say, well, what do you mean by that? It's like, well, this is what I mean. Slips of the tongue, the things you think are a good idea that turn out to be a lesson, but driven by the unconscious impulse, avoided that lesson. It's also because it's a point where material is pumping out of the unconscious that we might trip on. It's also the point where we repress things. So the things that we're trying to push down, like inner angers or rages or griefs or sadness, things that are difficult and uncomfortable in our humanity that we try to keep a lid on, that's a black moon thing as well. So it's the point that represents the unconscious that we trip on. Now, here's another history of astrology. I don't know why astrologers added Lilith as an archetype to black moon, but they did. Lilith was the first woman in the Canaanite origin story, where Adam and Lilith were created both from the same material and they were in equal stead to each other. So Lilith is a representation of the powerful divine feminine that is both creative and destructive that we have lost in the patriarchy. Right? And how did that happen? Well, the patriarchy in 800 BC threw her out and said, we don't want that strong, powerful feminine. We want to go with the subservient Eve because we can, do more controlling that way. And so the Jews rejected Lilith in 800 BC. And so this is where Lilith gets the sexual sort of, deviant consciousness, because she wanted to be on top sometimes and she was sexually sovereign, right? She wasn't going to just submit. So the patriarchy called that deviant sexual behavior and rejects Lilith as something to be feared. Meanwhile, here we are in our modern world. What are we trying to do? Dismantle the patriarchy and integrate this relationship with strong, powerful feminine energy that is both creative and destructive.
Bring it back.
That's right, baby. So the movement of Black Moon Lilith is kind of like our shadow work mascot. What is shadow work but allowing the impulses that are in the unconscious to pop up, and instead of blaming the world and others for what is troubling you in that unconscious bubbling up moment, you take responsibility for the impulses that are rising up and you say, what does this mean about me? And you do some work and healing, and that's shadow work defined in a woefully inadequate definition. But it's Black Moon Lilith that allows us to go into that inner space that is somewhat conscious, somewhat unconscious, where dark material is rising up, that if we don't confront it and look at it in the light of day, it will continue to trip us up. For the last 9 months, Black Moon Lilith has been in the sign of Cancer, which is deeply personal, very much about our intimate relationship with feelings and moods and phases. That moon-ruled Cancer dynamic is all about how we care for self and understand our feelings at the personal level. So shadow work has been deep and very much connected to family of origin stuff and past issues with mothers especially. And I described in my forecast, my 2023 forecast, as I was talking about Black Moon Lilith for the year ahead, I described how I work with Black Moon Lilith as an archetype when I was talking about my out-breath work in my breath work discipline. Because out-breath is scary. Out-breath is like death. Out-breath is deeply feminine. In-breath is masculine. I have great relationship with my in-breath, but my out-breath is where I'll get scared and panicky if I'm in a breathwork process that requires the out-breath to help like heal things and release things. I'll be in a breathwork moment and have that fear come in, that voice in my head that says, take a breath, take a breath, take a breath, you're losing breath. And I'll just, in my mind, call upon Black Moon Lilith. And for that 3 or 4 seconds, I am suddenly carried through a scary moment of out-breath, panic, because I've called upon the archetype of being comfortable in the lower depths where the unconscious and consciousness is sort of merging. So it's an archetype you can turn to. You can also take a look at where Leo now, because she's moving out of Cancer and into Leo for the next month. The house in your natal chart ruled by Leo is going to be a source of shadow work and transformation. And any planets you might have in Leo are going to be transited by conjunction by Black Moon Lilith over the next 9 months. And the consciousness of that planet might be the source of some shadow work for you as well in the 9 months to come. If this seems confusing to you, just understand that for the next 9 months, when you think about working with your shadow or working with your unconscious, you can call upon this energy to assist you in scary moments of that work, and know that with Black Moon Lilith in Leo, it's about doing the shadow work that might keep you from being more powerfully self-expressive in the world, because that's the energy of Leo. And if arrogance and over-ego drive is a shadow of yours, Black Moon Lilith in Leo will help you grapple with that, because that's where she's going to be visiting for the next 9 months, helping us heal ways in which arrogance and ego-driven consciousness might be part of the shadow that, you listeners might have to be working with. And that changeover happens today. But really, I bury the lead, right? The fact that I waited this long in the podcast to talk about Mars turning around is a little insane, because really, the big news of the week is on Friday, the planet of action and decision and anger and reactivity and goals and ambitions, who has been backward moving for 6 weeks, is going to finally turn around and go direct. But really, this entire month has had a challenge built into it that's not necessarily going to go away when Mars turns around on Friday, because he's literally been appearing to not move all month long. In fact, just as we enter January, he hit 8 degrees of Gemini. Here we are 9 days into the month and he's still at 8 degrees of Gemini. He's going to turn around in 4 days at 8 degrees of Gemini. And he's not going to move from that degree point until like January 25th. Like that's 12 days after he turns around and goes direct. Right. So I want you to think about Mars in a couple of ways today. One is, let's just think about Mars and how you relate to actions, decisions, anger, reactivity, goals, and ambitions as being problematic all month long. If Mars is how we choose and decide and move and go, and he's not moving and not going, how can we move and go? How can we decide clearly and definitively if the planet of action is not moving? And because he's not moving in the sign of Gemini, it's like a setup for overthinking, anxiety, not being able to be clear about decision making. So if you've had any challenges with that, understand that Mars's station is part of that, and that's distinct from whether he's backwards or forwards. So we're still in, as you're hearing this podcast, we're still in the process of Mars being backward, moving. We are not in the direct motion, and we go there Friday. And so there will be a shift that we will feel as Friday then becomes Saturday and Sunday, as we move through the weekend and take in this posture change. We are going to start to feel able to be clearer, to be more definitive, to be more decisive about our decisions without all of the waffling. So, one of the things that's part of this week, this is especially true for the weekend, because I'm also going to talk about this probably at the top of next week's podcast as well, is that Mercury, in his direct motion, is holding a prolonged great eliminator angle with Mars as he stops, stands still, and turns around. Just that geometry alone at the end of this week, let me interpret that. Mercury is how we think, Mars is how we act. If the thinker and the actor within us are passing through a fork in the road, and the thinker is backward moving, which means our minds are more in touch with our unconscious right now, because Mercury's backwards. Backwards is below. Below is the unconscious. There's something brewing as this week ends and we move into next weekend where we might need to make a shift in how we approach goals and ambitions we've been holding. We might have to shift goals and ambitions we've been holding because for 6 weeks, the planet that guides those things has been visiting the unconscious. And as he goes direct and moves forward in the weeks to come, we all may find that we have done some work in the below, that we want to do new things or move in new directions because we've changed things about how we feel in the unconscious over the last couple of months. But very specifically, as we move towards this weekend ahead, we might get ideas or downloads or conversations that allow us to consider new directions, projects that might have been important before you approach this Mars retrograde might not feel as important as you come out. Or conversely, something that you were marinating as a possibility might have now become a definitive, passionate desire and a powerful thrust. And that might be a shift in your path. It's that old adage of take the road less traveled by, which I don't want anybody to ever do that exclusively. Like, oh, I've not traveled this road, let's take it, because that road might lead you over a cliff. But in moments that the astrology says, take a look at or consider the road less traveled by, then I say it loudly. If towards the end of this week, some new idea arises to move in a new direction, the road less traveled by, take it. because Mercury and Mars are doing this in earnest, and Mercury is retrograde, which means he's got a tether to our unconscious thoughts, and Mars is just emerging from the unconscious Friday, which means it's like waking up from a dream state. You're like, oh my God, I had the craziest dream, and the dream was to change the track I'm on. So it's also going to be a bumpy week for all things Mars and Mercury, which means choices, actions, anger, and communication, because Mercury is still retrograde and Mars is shifting and turning around. So you can be assured that every day, no matter what else might be happening in the solar system that's delivering a particular sensation on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, for sure, Mercury retrograde, Mars turning around makes for a week where communication and choice-making decisions and response to anger could be a little bit dicey and bumpy. Just keep that in mind as you go. So outside of what Mercury and Mars are going to do as the weekend turns into next week that I just described, that I will absolutely be describing again at the top of next week's podcast, Mercury is, in fact, hitting two very important triple transits in his backward motion this Wednesday and Friday that harken back to things in mid-December. So let's talk about that, because it's going to be an interesting week from Mercury's perspective while Mars is turning around. So the two transits are a trine from Mercury to the North Node and a square from Mercury to Chiron. One is about flow. The other one is about stopping flow to work on a wound. Flow in this equation is because the North Node of the moon is about flow itself, because the North Node marks where we want to go next. It's the future calling us forward. Also flow because a triangle, 120-degree angle, is the angle of flow. It's the angle of harmony, balance, and flow. So this whole Mercury retrograde cycle in Capricorn, which is concerned with goals, ambitions, climbing the mountain of your desires. This is why there's such an interesting relationship between Mercury's retrograde and what Mars is doing, because Capricorn is an action-oriented, goal-driven sign. So Mercury in Capricorn, trining the North Node of the moon, means the entire retrograde cycle furthers our ambitions and needs and wants by virtue of this trine from Mercury to the North Node. The but, because there's always a but in astrology, is a square to Chiron means you don't climb the mountain if there's a wound in your backpack. Chiron holds our wounded consciousness in abeyance while we, wait around till the moment comes when we're ready to heal a wound. And a square for Mercury is an undeniable rising up of a wounded consciousness that stops you in your tracks, because it's a square that needs your mental attention, either internally, examining wounds inside of yourself, or conversations with others that are important to you that relate to wounded consciousness. So we put these two together and we have an impulse to both move powerfully forward because we know who we are, we know what we desire, we know what mountain we want to climb, but not without the demand to capitulate or respond to the wounds inside of you that might say, well, I can't climb that mountain, I'm not good enough, or I'm not ready, or I'm not worthy. These two transits rose up on December 14th and 15th. The square to Chiron was the 14th, the trine to North Node was the 15th, but you can just look at the 3, 4, 5 days before and after the 14th and 15th and take a look. If anything came up in conversation or thought form that felt important, it's likely going to show up again this second half of the week, where Wednesday is the square to Chiron. That might mean the awareness of wound comes first. And then on Friday, just as Mars is turning around, sort of saying, now you can begin moving again, Mercury trines the North Node saying, yes, this is where I want to go. So even though Mercury has to wrap this up by coming around and hitting these same transits at the end of January, we're not out of the Mercury retrograde holdback.
Mm-hmm.
There is something very powerful about how this week ends that has our bodies ready to move again because Mars turns around, but not like right away. It's not like he's going to turn around on Friday and we're going to be running marathons on Saturday, or I guess I should say sprints, right? But our minds will know. Our mind will be able to this week and say, yes, now that this is freed up, that's where I want to go. You want to look for that kind of stuff over this weekend, that impulse to say, I'm ready, or at least I see where I want to go. And if you can't feel that with the kind of joy and gusto that you wish, maybe look back to mid-December and see if you have any clues to what your Mercury retrograde cycle might yet be demanding of you as we move through the rest of the month, because he's not done.
So when will Mercury go direct?
Next week. In fact, he goes direct on the 18th. So that's like Wednesday, I think, of next week.
Yes. Yeah, Wednesday next week.
So you can imagine that this week and next week are important and valuable because we've been held back by these retrogrades. And now we're getting notice that we're not quite going to be held back anymore, but like in layers, right? Mars turns around Friday, but Mercury is still holding us back. Then Mars will take a couple of weeks to get moving again. He doesn't hit 9 degrees of Gemini till like January 25th.
Mm-hmm.
So while the retrogrades will end this week and next week, the entire middle weeks of January are still going to be bumpy from the impact of 2 personal planets retrograde at the same time, who are turning around and going direct within 5 days of each other. We will talk more about that next week because it's really a 2-week process. But as you finish this week, kids, I wish you all the ability to look up into your sights of where you're headed and have a sense of, at last, I think I know where I'm going next. Have at it.
All right, it's dream segment time. Every week, Dr. Michael will interpret dreams that are sent in via email or take a live caller. If you would like your dream interpreted on the podcast, you can go ahead and email us at dreams@michaellennox.com. Hopefully your dream will make it onto the show. Today we have an email in dream from Deborah, and Deborah writes, "Hello. In my dream, I was moving home, but it was my old childhood home mixed with my current home. In our waking world, we are actually trying to move from the current residence, as it's been very disruptive, but it's taking a while. I was getting my children ready to go and making sure everything was in order. It was morning time. As I was moving about inside, one of my daughters opened the window and in flew an enormous wasp. I was trying to get it back outside without antagonizing it too much with rash actions, and because my children were present, I didn't want them hurt. As I got it to fly toward the window, it turned and sat upon my neck and shoulder. It actually nestled into my neck. I froze because I was scared of what it was about to do. Then it started to pierce my skin with its stinger. I was still trying to be as still as possible, but it was mixed with tremendous fear. My children were looking on at the spectacle in horror. Its stinger was so long it pierced through my neck and into my shoulder, hitting the nerve. I was in so much pain, but still couldn't move. I awoke in a really thankful state. I was only dreaming after all, but it stuck with me, pardon the pun, and I was rattled for the rest of the week. Any interpretation would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Well, I love a good pun.
You do.
Right, yes.
That's true.
Besides loving a good pun, I love a good animal totem dream.
Yeah.
This is medicine. This is a medicine dream, make no mistake about it. And one of the ways we know that is because there's the presence of an animal. And in dreams, we ascribe sort of totem medicine to animals who appear in our dreams. And one of the things I like to tell people is that it is very, very rare for me to hear a animal medicine dream that doesn't come with fear or rejection somehow of the power of the medicine.
Right.
You know, very few people dream of bears going, oh, thank God the bear medicine is here. They usually dream of, there's a bear. But still, we know that the presence of the animal says it's an animal medicine dream. And the behavior of this animal, this wasp, is very much about stimulating this medicine, the stinger going into Deborah as a dreamer. So there's just no mistaking that this is an animal totem dream about wasp medicine. So this is the thing about animal medicine, like the meaning. You can go anywhere for animal meaning, and you'll find it. I've written a book on Dream Dictionary, and I have a definition of wasp. I liken wasps to bees and ants. They are community of insects, so there's always going to be messages about community and what happens when many parts work together to facilitate whatever's being attempted. So in my dream dictionary, I go on to talk about wasps as sort of predatory and aggressive in nature, right? So I would think that any wasp, bee, ant dream is going to be about getting things done in an organized fashion. All the little moving parts make some sense with certain insects that operate in community. Wasp has that, but it has something extra and dark because of their nature. Like, we don't think of wasps and honeybees in the same way. Right?
No.
But I am not the only owner of meaning, right? And so I did something that I invite all of you guys out there to do with dreams, is go to the best dream dictionary that ever was written. And I'm not talking about mine, but you can buy mine, Llewellyn's Complete Dictionary of Dreams by Dr. Michael Lennox. No, the best dream dictionary ever written is Google. So here's something that I just did, was as I heard the dream and was writing my notes, I also went into Google to see, well, what would come up if I just said wasp, animal, totem, meaning. And in two different places, I saw that it's about taking action and new beginnings. Now, that's fascinating to me, that Deborah's talking about a dream about taking on a big task that's also a new beginning. I personally would never go to new tasks and beginnings with wasp medicine, but I know that I'm not the end all of all wisdom, so I offer to Deborah my take on wasp as organized system to attend to details that are voluminous, but that also has a little bit of anger, fear, and gravitas in it. And then Google tells us that it's also a medicine of new beginnings and marshaling resources. So if we then go back to the top of the dream with this consciousness already in our sort of basket, we know that she's moving a home, but it's a childhood home mixed with her current home. So somehow, Deborah, in the process of upending your family and the home now, is you're having a connection to your own sort of arc of life and the relationship to home and, what it was to be a child in a home, but also an adult with a home with children in it, right? We're blurring consciousness of what home means and what moving means, right? Because homes are just a reflection of self in dreamland, because in waking life, our homes reflect us. So Deborah moving home now as a mother is also having experiences of Deborah moving home as a daughter, right? The dream is saying, hey, think about the whole generational experience of you. So the fact that she's trying to move in real life is very, appropriate to this dream. It's very literally, It's morning in the dream, which means we're not in Shadowland. We're not in something that needs some investigation. We're actually in the consciousness of newness, because morning is about what is new, what is just rising up. So we're not about completion. We're not about looking under the surface. We're about what is dawning in our own world, what is rising up. So the wasp flying in, I mean, the daughter opening the window could be that innocence allows this consciousness to be aware and available to us. Daughter opens the window. And something rises up that Deborah's impulse is to get this outside. Don't let this get, I don't want to antagonize the wasp because then it might be dangerous to us all. That reminds me of what it might be like as a mother of children in the middle of a move, attempting desperately to keep things unchaotic when it's a chaotic experience. Because all that effort in the dream to be like, let's not antagonize from this, reflects an effort to keep things a certain kind of way of sort of calm and not, challenged. The fact that this now wasp impacts Deborah's neck and shoulders is interesting to me. First, let's just make a note that this wasp meant business, right? That long stinger going all the way in says, you will get this medicine if I have to pierce your nerve system to get this stinger into you, right? There's an earnestness in
the nerve system is pretty dramatic.
Yes, but look what Deborah does. She's trying to be still, though she's filled with fear. This tells me that her psyche is in some profound awareness that something needs to be added, even though it's scary, right?
Yeah.
The fact that it's the neck and shoulders is interesting to me, and I'll start with the shoulder consciousness, to me, is about bearing the burden of this enormous task. Because the shoulders are always about what weight are we being asked to shoulder. So the wasp says, I sit on your shoulder to allow you to have more sort of aggressive energy to shoulder this wound. And I pierce your neck so your voice will have inside of it this wasp medicine that might allow you to trust yourself more, to not be so afraid that you're going to antagonize the space with your voice. Now, if we had Deborah here, I could ask her questions about like, well, how are you relating? Like, where's your anxiety going? Are you over expressing in certain, environments with your kids where you're wanting to keep things sort of light and breezy, but you're in a chaotic experience? Wasp medicine in your voice will help you have the voice that allows the difficult thing you're trying to accomplish be there without being antagonizing or problematic, right? If you're trying to keep a sweet, light, and easy breezy voice when things are not sweet, light, and easy breezy, that might be hard to do, but wasp medicine in your voice will give you a voice that has that power in it so that you don't have to be so worried that you're going to antagonize or, bring something into the mix that you don't wish or desire to in the world of anxiety and breakdown. So, Deborah, I hope you're listening, and I it's always a limit when I don't have the person here to like ask specific questions to. So I may have missed the boat about exactly how you're holding the chaotic waking life event of moving. But please understand that something your psyche is saying to you is that you can allow a little bit more sting in your voice without having to worry that that's going to have you out there sort of wasping it up, ruining everybody's, buzz. And as I like to say, Deborah, with regard to your waking life actual move, have at it.
Thank you for listening to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. You can find us on Apple Music, the iHeartRadio app, and anywhere you find your favorite shows. Head on over to michaellennox.com for information on astrology readings, the daily Astro Alert subscription, upcoming classes, and to join the mailing list.